You're an agribusiness executive navigating an increasingly competitive market while trying to grow your company. Mergers and acquisitions are pitched as an accelerant to growth, but many M&A deals destroy more value than they create. Welcome to the Pacesetter Pod, where we explore and reveal the perspectives, insights, and approaches for successful mergers and acquisitions. Here's your host, the Integration Pacesetter, Joe Mosher.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Pacesetter Pod. I am your host, Joe Mosher. Thank you, as always, for choosing to spend your time with us today. Now, if I asked you the question, if we're sitting across the table from one another, and I ask you, what is consistently the most painful operating constraint in your agribusiness? What would you tell me? A couple of years ago, you might have said it's the availability of fertilizer products and crop inputs. Right now, you might be saying it's availability of labor or the right labor. Sometimes it might be lead times on equipment or mobile equipment and rolling stock or plant investments, etc. But I'm guessing that on a longitudinal basis, if I ask this question to you over and over and over time, the vast majority of responses would come down to the same thing: capital and availability of resources. And I'm just going to run you through a few examples as I think about my career and the businesses I work with and the positions I've held. A lot of the lens through which we work comes back to capital. You know, how much better could you maintain your assets if you had budget, right? That comes back to money. How much better or faster could your production facilities be if you had access to capital? How much more could we advance our strategy if we just had a few more of the right people? It presents as a people challenge. It's ultimately a budget, finance, and capital challenge. You know, how could we improve maybe our products and services if we weren't running cash right at the razor's edge and having to put every single line item on trial for its life? And overall, how much better positioned would we be for the coming planting or application season or harvest or whatever it might be? How much better positioned would we be if we could focus on building inventory, investing in our assets, training our people, and not having to be watching cash flow, not have to be watching working capital pressures, etc. I could go on and on and on, but I think you get the point. Here's the thing. All of that is wrong. It's not capital as an operating constraint that's the biggest issue in your business. It's likely focus. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. I want to share with you an example, something that I've experienced recently that really highlights this issue and really brought it into focus for me on how important focus is to a business, even more important than having an abundance of resources available. I want to talk to you about how being resource rich but focus deficient is actually a pretty destructive cocktail, how that shows up and what the consequences of that can be. And then I want to also try to arm you with a few things that you can start doing today and start thinking about today to help you improve focus if some of the things we talk about sound way too painfully familiar as you look at your business. So let's start off with story time. And I want to talk to you about an organization that we've come to know and have discussions with and work with recently. They're a very well capitalized private entity. This organization has spent years making very significant investments all along the ag value chain, right? Really have a long-term view to what they're trying to do and create. They've got very big ideas for growth. It's matched with a strong appetite to win. Very aggressive, very proactive, very action-oriented organization. And they're operating in a very different resource environment than anything I've ever been accustomed to. And I'm guessing different than what most of us have been accustomed to in our careers. And for a moment, when I started working with these individuals, with this company, it just looked like the Holy Grail. It was a chance to answer the question for myself, if capital was unconstrained, what might be possible? And now, obviously, the idea of unconstrained capital is a bit hyperbolic, right? There are limits to spending. There is a limit to capital availability. Resources are not infinite, but they are abundant. And that was the big difference for me. Now, obviously, these are very sophisticated investors and operators. They're well capitalized for a reason. And there's not really any fire hydrant of money being poured on every idea. But again, they do operate under a very different paradigm and very different circumstances than any other firm I have worked with or for in my years in agribusiness. And here's what I noticed in the course of these discussions as we looked at past investments, recent investments, potential investments at their fingertips, maybe a little bit mid to long term. Capital abundance doesn't solve your problems. And in fact, it can magnify them. It puts a lot of very acute and particular pressure on perhaps the most precious resource of all that you have is focus. So if you have abundant resources like this organization does, but you perhaps some opportunities to improve focus like all organizations do, this creates a really dangerous tension. And some of the things that I've observed is when capital is unconstrained, everything that comes up for sale deserves a look, right? In a conventional business, competitors or partners or suppliers or others along the value chain will potentially either come up for sale or there'll be rumors that they're for sale. And you can pretty quickly, through the lens of constrained capital, make a decision about, is that something that's even worth talking about and pursuing? And usually, or many times, it's that capital constraint that throttles how much time and investment you give to that idea. But when you remove that constraint, suddenly everything deserves a look. When funds are abundant, any gap in your business or value chain can cry out for resources. And then the default can be, if you're not careful, to start to just simply add resources, add people, add leadership, add layers, add advisors, add contractors, whatever it might be, right? You throw people and resources at it to fix the problem without really having a chance to sit back and say, is this gap in our business one that we actually need to be spending time on? Is this material to our long-term success? And similarly, when money is not an operating constraint, every good idea demands attention, right? Because you're not looking through the lens of what's the availability of funding we have for all the different things we want to do. And through that lens, what do we automatically need to screen out? And so what this set of observations has really brought into focus for me is that lack of money is not the culprit. A lot of companies, in fact, most companies in our industry operate with very high capital requirements from investment. We have very brutal competition for incredibly thin margins. And we're exposed to the entire universe of external factors from trade policy to weather to whatever it might be that really impacts the both the supply and the demand for the goods and services that we produce. And so I think the real and often underappreciated danger is a lack of focus. And I've learned that honestly, it's better to take capital constraints over having focus as your scarce resource any day. Now, I want to be clear. The company I'm referring to or referred to here a moment ago is doing a good job of not falling victim to the siren song of taking action simply because they can afford to. But I see the tension become very acute. In many ways, very similar to a conventional ag value chain company where they're constantly trying to figure out how do we better focus. But what I had always assumed was if we had more capital, some of these conventional problems might diminish in the pain and the impact that they have. And in fact, they don't. The abundance of capital, what puts pressure on the business, it puts pressure on leadership and on the people and on processes. And so I think that this story, this case study, if you will, this organization, they're illustrative of the real folly of the myth that money, more availability of money is the answer to business growth. I'm convinced that it's not. So I want to maybe spend a moment here talking about why I see this as such a bad combination. And the bad combination, again, being resource rich, focus deficient. It's a bold claim. And I think you deserve to know a little bit more about how I got there, how I see it. What is clear to me is that focus can fix your money problems, but money cannot fix focus problems. If you have focus deficiency, excess cash is just like pouring gasoline on the fire. Many of you, perhaps all of you, have heard of the notion, and there's probably a name for this principle, but the idea that if you schedule 30 minutes to talk about a problem, the team that you pull together will develop an action plan for what they want to do next within the 30 minutes available. But if you schedule the same people working on the same problem for 60 minutes, it's going to take, you guessed it, 60 minutes. The process, that people use to get to the outcome expands or contracts to accommodate the time that you made available for it. And I believe that focus is the same way. If you consistently take on efforts as a business that are going to demand 150% of the available resources, be it time, people, money, etc., if you're always overshooting your abilities by 50%, expanding the resources is not just going to make you reach equilibrium between resources and efforts.
Poorly executed mergers and acquisitions destroy more value than they create. They can set your company back years. To defend your firm's position in the marketplace, you need access to the leading practices that unlock the greater potential of your people, processes, and systems. If you are undertaking a company transformation or pursuing an acquisition as a vehicle to grow, set up a call with Joe by visiting www.moshercg.com.
You might temporarily reach an equilibrium where you kind of breathe a sigh of relief and say, okay, thank goodness, we got some additional resources. We got some funding for this project. We've got the people we need. And now everything is back on par. But if this is an operational norm, if this is a cultural issue, if the focus in the first place didn't prevent you from going 150% over what you could actually do, the scope of your efforts are going to expand accordingly. You're going to end up replicating that dislocation of resources and objectives. You increase the resource availability, you reach par, temporary equilibrium, everyone feels good. Well, guess what? That feeling good is going to feel like an unfamiliar comfort. It's going to feel like maybe we're not pushing as hard. And so what's going to happen? Additional expectations, additional ideas, additional efforts are going to pile on. And pretty soon you're going to be at the same 50% deficiency that you were before, just now at a wider scale and potentially with more serious consequences because the aggregate demand of the business has actually grown. It repeats itself in cases where capital abundance is also not a factor. So this is not really just a capital issue, but I think that's what's been the real learning for me. But think about any project you've been a part of, any process improvement effort, any change effort, whatever it might be. Maybe you're short on people. Work is struggling, progress is struggling. People feel like the operating constraint. You add people. What happens? Suddenly the scope of the work expands because you've got more people. That's a focus issue. Maybe you add production capacity. Temporarily, the supply chain normalizes. You start to produce at the level that you wanted. Everyone's happy. Origination, production, merchandising, etc. Eventually, over time, you'll start outstripping your capacity. You'll outpunch your coverage, if you will. That deficiency, that dislocation is going to replicate itself again and again and again if the underlying issue of focus has not been addressed. So this has been part of the interesting learning for me, is that it's just this elastic nature of that dislocation between availability, resources, and focus. And I think that this lack of focus actually sits like a latent drag on the performance of our businesses and the results that we generate. But let's get back to capital specifically. You cannot spend your way out of a focus problem. More spending only addresses the symptoms, and it feeds the disease. It creates the conditions for you to replicate it at a bigger scale. But what you can do is you can focus your way out of a spending problem. Getting better at focus, having the processes and the culture and the discipline in place to evaluate different ideas, evaluate opportunities, and make smart decisions about which ones have the biggest opportunity to impact your strategy, as well as staying rooted in the available capacity and resources to do it. Getting better at focus will act as a governor, and it's going to throttle those wild spending impulses, and not just spending of capital, but spending of time, spending of people, spending of energy. So it's all fine and good for me to talk on and on and on about how this challenge shows up and how problematic this challenge is for businesses. But what can you do to improve this? All the work that we do at Mosher Consulting Group and what I've dedicated the majority of my career to is helping companies execute better. And execution requires focus. Focus is a muscle. We all have it, but not all of us have the same genetic gifts, right? Some people just have better focus than others. We don't all have the same behaviors in place. Behaviors to either build that muscle or maintain it. And I say this because it's so alluring to think that there's some kind of a silver bullet to getting better at focus. And unfortunately, there isn't. What I'd like to do, though, is leave you with a few things here today that could help. The first thing is remarkably simple in concept, a little bit more difficult to execute. But if you want to improve your focus in your organization, do good strategy work. There's a lot that goes into this, but at the end of the day, if you have done the work to design and deliver a well-built and a very clearly articulated strategy, that should drive focus. It shouldn't encumber your ability to focus. If you've got a strategy where every idea that crops up in the business at every level, from every department, from every location, from every division, if every idea that pops up can be justified as something we need to pursue under our strategy, chances are your strategy isn't explicit and prescriptive enough about where the key drivers are. Your strategy should actually help you set up some lenses by which you can make some of those preliminary decisions. Is this core to the things that are going to drive long-term value creation? So first things first, if focus is an issue, look in the mirror and ask yourself, are we doing good strategy work? The second thing I would encourage us all to think about as we step back and look at our businesses is think in terms of operating systems. There's a lot of different processes out there that are proven to help focus and as a result, improve your execution. There's a couple of pretty interesting books that, depending on the size of your organization, you might want to consider reading. Again, these aren't necessarily endorsements to say, go ahead and pursue these operating systems, but I have found them very helpful for leadership to have a different framing of how their business runs. The two popular examples in business management, the business management canon, if you will, is the books Traction and 4 Disciplines of Execution. Now, there's a lot more, but these are two that I want to call out. Traction, if you've not read it, is all about the entrepreneurial operating system, or EOS, as it's commonly called. And it has been transformational in thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of small businesses and helping them get better at really focusing on what matters most and delivering the big results that are derived from that focus, and then kind of creating a business that's more fun to work in and more rewarding to operate. Traction is frankly, I think, recommended reading for anybody, whether you ever intend to adopt it or not, because it does such a great job of helping show those basic building blocks, those basic levers that have to be in place to enable focus. Now, it is particularly designed for very small organizations. And so if you're a company that's maybe, I don't know what their threshold is, but maybe up to 1,000, 2,000 or more employees, you might start to see that the framework doesn't quite apply as well. That's a novice opinion from the outside looking in. But another example, something that I reread recently, is the 4 Disciplines of Execution, which shares, in my mind, some core principles with EOS. But it's written and designed for somewhat larger companies. It goes into great detail about a process for defining what your most impactful breakthrough objectives are, and then focusing there. And like Traction or EOS, it doesn't just articulate the importance or maybe at a conceptual level how to do it. It actually kind of gives you a roadmap, how to define what your breakthrough objectives are. And then what do you need to do from process standpoint to define the goals to drive that? How do you measure and monitor it? How do you keep people engaged? And it even goes through the work of saying, are you a frontline leader? And here's how it works. Here's how focus will work at the frontline level. Or are you a leader of leaders? Are you middle or upper management? And so I think it helps kind of find some through lines around how you can drive better focus from an operating system perspective throughout your business. And then the last one that I'll leave you with here today is, if you've thought about your ability to focus or your focus deficiency through the lens of our strategy and our operating system, the next thing is also to think about it in terms of process. And from a process standpoint, there's many different tools that you can use. One that I'm a very big proponent of is portfolio management. Now, I'm not going to get into the details here today, but portfolio management in principle is an organizational process and framework that helps you align your strategy to your investment activities. And these investment activities could be how you invest your people's focuses. It could be how you invest capital. It kind of runs the gamut there. But it helps you make sure that you're doing the right projects. And the right projects are defined as those that have outsized impact on the business. And if you're an organization that is good at process, if you're an organization that has a culture, operating norms, and people who like to know what the process is, they like to follow the process, they like to hold one another accountable, then I think portfolio management could have huge upside opportunities for you. If you missed it, you can go back and listen to episode 40, which is called Managing Ag Strategy as a Portfolio of Opportunities, to learn a bit more conceptually about what portfolio management does, what problems it solves, and how it can show up and really have a big impact in agribusiness. So I want to recap today. Limited resources are not the operating constraint that you need to be preoccupied with. Or at least from my opinion, it's not the boogeyman of poor execution, unless you have absolute conviction that your focus is where it needs to be. Focus can fix money problems, but money problems cannot solve for focus. You cannot spend your way out of a bad focus habit, no matter how deep your pockets, no matter how big your balance sheet. Eventually, your bank account will run out of funds. It will run to zero before your ideas run out every single time. And while limited capital is sometimes a variable that you cannot control for, building the focus muscle is something you can work on. To build that focus muscle, do good strategy work. Look at your operating system. Think in terms of processes and think about how you can hone your ability to look at investments and opportunities through the lens of what's going to be the biggest impact to our business. Now, the importance of focus as an enabler of success is not novel. It's not a new concept. And I know and admit that I probably should have said that at the top of the show. But just because the content around it is ubiquitous doesn't mean we don't need to keep talking about it. In fact, I hypothesize that since we don't talk about focus enough, we all sort of take it for granted of course, Joe, that's really important. Because we just sort of accept it silently and quietly, that actually contributes to the deficiencies that many of us experience. So I hope you found this helpful today. If you did, we would love it if you take the time to leave a review of the show. And if we're not hitting on topics that are important to your business, if we're not talking about the things that are obstacles to growth that you're facing, please reach out and let us know. We'd love to know where you're at, what you're working on, and how we can maybe spend time developing conversations that could be of support to you. Remember to like and subscribe to the Pacesetter Pod on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if what we talked about today struck a chord with you and you want to continue the conversation, you can connect with me, Joe Mosher, on LinkedIn, or set up a call directly by visiting Mosher Consulting Group online at moshercg.com. Thank you as always for listening, and I hope you have a safe day.
This is the podcastfactory.com.